very calm. Or at least he seems like he is.
Good form.
Alright, Mom, do you mind handing me the little sword?
Yeah, that's all right.
You can see with him being a little bit more trained, he can make a little bit of a tighter circle and do some of the same stuff. A little bit more tightness around where we're going. Now, one of the things, we kind of don't do a whole lot of trot when we do this. I'll kind of see as I go and trot here. This is a bit more bouncy here as we're going. So it's possible, but it's a lot more bouncy. And actually a little bit less, we have a little bit less room to wiggle. It's a little harder, so while at walk, well, you're not going to go to another bathroom break. At walk, we can make a very tight turn. And, you know, we can go each way. We can even turn around the front end a bit. So I can even pivot around the front end. Trotting gets a lot harder. It's actually easier to do it at center.
Yep.
A little bit tight there. Come on, bud. You can see he can fly a little bit higher. It's a little bit of a tighter turn. But he can do what's called yacht, which can make tighter turns as well. But it's a little bit harder to do. The canter is much more smooth, silky, easy to ride. Whoops. Hello, bud. Come on. A little hot today. Come on. Come on. However, a lot of times, doing his stuff, let's say from trot, if I'm kind of reading to see what's about to happen, I can kind of piaffe, and then from here, come on, bud. Come on, let's try that again. And then from here, flip flop. I can go fairly fast out of that. Get a little bit of a bigger stride hit. Good boy. So it takes a lot more training to get there. This guy has had quite a bit. And even that is still pretty difficult. Come on. But you get off and canter pretty much in place, not taking up a lot of room. Of course, that takes a lot of strength and stamina, so we're still building that up a bit. But you can kind of see how that would look in a more intensive sparring situation. Very, very tight canter work, which takes all of this beef doesn't it? Yes, it does. So yeah.
Yeah. All right, that was cool.
Yes. But he is one of our main breeding studs as well. He is also kind of our ultimate demo stud whenever we want to do pretty much anything relating to classical riding or historical riding. He's our man. So he does all kinds of good stuff. A little bit of a misconception a lot of people have about medieval riding warfare is that they use big draft horses. So this is something I forgot to cover earlier, like Shires or Clydesdales. When you look at the artwork, they really use a horse shorter in proportion to the rider than even this guy to me. And so, like, I'm 5'8", and he's barely above pony size. He's pretty tiny. And this is still not the proportion. Their legs would often be down to here in proportion to their horse. So they really used quite small horses, and a lot of the guys still weren't even that small. I've kind of been a pretty average height for most of history. So you can imagine using very, very small horses with these guys, and that was the most effective. Go figure.
Was that for handiness, most likely, or what?
Yeah, handiness and just what they could easily breed. So, you get a big chunky draft horse. Drafts are fantastic for pulling plows, for pulling heavy things. Because they're so bred to pull and push, they're not as great for sitting back and carrying. So a lot of times you'll see draft horses don't always necessarily have the easiest of canters to gather up and do this stuff. Having trained draft horses, yes, that is very much the case. So that was not a typical choice, even though that's kind of what somehow ends up being kind of the Hollywood story. So you see people on big Frisians and big horses, and really it was small horses with decent sized warriors and all their armor and other stuff.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
A
Question.
lot more agile.
So they'll be more agile and more quicker, more easier to maneuver.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so
And especially when you actually add some of the weight of the weapons and stuff. Here's a question: where's my garrocha pole? It's over there. So this is an adjacent art form to swordsmanship. And I can use the pole kind of to demonstrate some of the lance stuff. So garrocha is actually Spanish art based on how they work cattle. So they, instead of using ropes and stuff to work cattle, they use poles like this. Well, when you get back to like 15th century Dom Duarte or King Edward of Portugal, he talks about a lot of practicing for battle with stuff. And some of the techniques he talks about are very adjacent to some of the art with the garrocha. I'm not going to show as much of the garrocha art, as cool as it is beautiful, but it is hot, and we're all getting a little bit cooked. I will show how some of the things that we did with a very light sword are actually almost easier with this thing. So, come on, bud. I know, you thought you were done. You're not. Sorry, sweetie. So, something like this, that's actually a very traditional technique used in lance. So, I'll show again, maybe a different angle. So I'm actually taking this It's not a garrocha technique at all. And that actually, you can see he flew much higher, much more easily. I can even go the opposite way. And bring him under it again. So that's kind of one of those things.
That's fine.
Kind of show how fencing and land can actually make training the horse and rider much,
That's fine.
easier. Jacqueline can attest to that
All the horse.
as well.
Here. You put it on me, quit.
Could you move, sweetie? Could you move, please? No,
Boy,
yeah,
that
thank
was
you.
a big one. That was a big one.
Cool.
Nope, nope.
Says, I
Step on
can
the spider.
do that.
Why not?
So yeah, that's kind of
Hey,
a
no,
little
no,
bit
step on the
somewhat
spider.
adjacent.
We'll jump on the spider.
This is a very fancy garrocha from Home Depot.
I'm gonna jump on the
Cut
spider.
down a couple feet.
here,
But it
friend.
works very well to
Come on.
show and teach some of the other
Let's go.
things. So yeah. Question.
So, what was the endurance of these guys? Because I think in modern dressage, you have a very, like, this is you spend 30 minutes and maybe do like 5 to 10 is heavy collective work. But I'm picturing a battle is not going to be, well, it might not be over in 5 to 10 minutes. So they come from far away.
Well, a lot of times they might take a break as well. So they go in, come back, take a little break, go back, take a break. But yeah, no, so when you look at the old manuals, like 16th century and such, where they finally start focusing teaching horsemanship, they mostly focus on swordsmanship first and then horsemanship in writings. We actually have evidence of like schooling the horse for miles and miles and miles just on a circle or around a big field. So like Federico Grizzone in the 16th century says like, oh well, take an experienced horse in a freshly plowed field, ride a track so that's nice and packed, and then take a young horse on it so they can't mess up the circle, because otherwise they step in heavier, harder to work in stuff, and ride them for, 20 circles of this size in one direction and 20 in the other, and then take them out in the camp, take them out in the field and do more stuff. So, and then when you talked past tense unfortunately, to some of the old guys from the Spanish riding school, one of the gentlemen I worked with was at the Spanish riding school in the 50s and 60s. He said, they used to take the young horses out to do stuff for 6-7 miles in a workout, no worries, just in the arena, just work them for 6-7 miles and then, turn them back out. They might go out again, might ride a few hours, no biggie. And to us, that's kind of like, oh my gosh, in the dressage context. So, and he was even complaining about they were losing some of the old warfare stuff. And that's very much the case now, where you see workouts of 20-30 minutes and that's it. So they definitely school the horses a few times a week to, go for miles and miles and miles and miles, just because you needed it. So that made a big difference as well. A very
Is that
good question.
originally one of the reasons for the Arabian influence?
Might be. Some of it was also political. So you had a little bit of politics involved as well of, we got to deal with these Ottoman Turks that are doing stuff, so maybe we kind of make friends with, enemy of our enemy is our friend a little bit. So there's a bit of politics about importing the stallion, Siglavi, and some other mares to influence the Spanish horse. So yeah, there was a little bit of that involved too. So yeah. Any other questions?
Can you talk about the bit setup that
Yeah.
you're using?
So he's in, this is pretty typical of the, kind of more of like it's fairly typical of even before 1700s. They worked a lot in curb bits back then. They considered snaffles to be the farmer's bit, so they did not like to work in some of the simpler bits that we're used to. So this one's based off of, I think, a 17th or 18th century kind of thing. It allows a little bit more finesse and flex and control when you're riding reins in one hand. So you would think it'd mean, you know, oh, I can work, you know, this is a lot, it can be a bit of a stronger bit in some dimensions. However, because the way it works, there's actually a lot room for finesse than you would think. So this one, I have 2 reins on the same bit. He loves this. This is his bit. He just absolutely adores this bit. Earlier, we had Rubia in more of a snaffle. That is her favorite kind of thing. That's just for her. And then Mila was in 2 bits. And that works really well for her. So we kind of go off of what works for the horse. Back historically, it was more something like this. This is very, very typical for the period. They even typically, you can see he has nothing on his nose. Actually, none of them, well, Mila did, just for no real reason. They had nothing around the nose much. That's really very much a more 1800s kind of thing, is having more of the nose bands. Because of fox hunting, believe it or not. That's when nose bands really came to be used.
So, for the double bridle, where did that come into play?
That started to come into play probably the 1700s. It started to come into play, and they did all kinds of crazy stuff with that. So we start seeing like Francois de la Grenière, he had diagrams of using more double bridles or having a snaffle and then using the double. They had a lot of really creative things that they did around that period and a bit before. They had what are called cavesins that are 3-ring. I don't know how you would just necessarily describe them. They're cavesins. Kind of almost a bitless bridles to a certain extent. You attach the rings to the front of the nose, basically. And so you can use that. That's a very different influence. That's actually really nice. We use those here. We use those a lot for work in hand, for lunging, but you can also use them for riding and have very different feel than a bit. Today often you see a lot of diagrams of them using a cavesin and a curve. But we also, after oral tradition, a lot of other combinations that sort of boggle the mind.
No, I was chasing
All
away
the
a spider.
different ways that we can approach stuff for different horses' needs. So, kind of about that time they started doing, start the horse in a snaffle, then go to a double. They kind of go like, go from a snaffle, go to some weird combination for a double, and then eventually single curve only. So they had a lot of different ways of approaching stuff. They're, in many ways, when you know the oral tradition and you study the books, you see how much of it was very much horse-led. It was very much led by the horse how this was done. Which is kind of interesting when you consider, you know, a lot of, you know, what we hear from the period as being, you know, oh, they believed, you know, animals couldn't feel pain and all this kind of stuff. They kind of had ideas about, you know, horses needing to trust first and foremost. We have a lot of quotes about that. So even manuals that talk about, you know, medieval manuals talking about how to kill each other, talk about being kind to your horse. And we have 17th century, Antoine de Pluvinel says, a horse educated out of fear can never be trusted, for there will always be something he will fear more than the rider. That's pretty profound, and it's very true. So that's where a lot of this, out of necessity, because the horse will be more afraid of something else than he will of the rider, the training was guided very much by, oh no, we got to build trust, instead of, nah, just spur, whip, fit, you know, just force them into it, because they will very much say, not today. We're not gonna, you know, I may be scared of you, but those cannons going off and all those people in flanking armor, all these arrows, no way, I am not sticking around. So it's very interesting that we have this sort of very humane approach that's been, you know, very much talked about in all the good horsemanship manuals of all the top horsemen of the day. It's all humane, humane, humane. Give your horse treats, school to music, do all this stuff. And it's all born out of very much necessity. So go figure.
That's good though.
It's very, very fascinating.
Are you familiar with any of the background with the horse soldiers that were used?
In Afghanistan?
Yes.
Yeah, so a lot of those were Afghani horses, I believe. Yeah, I've known some soldiers who were deployed who did use horses some. It's a little bit of a different approach, but it's very fascinating because there is still some of that element of trust, a little bit mutual trust that horse trusts the soldier, you know, for certain things, and the soldier also trusts the horse. So you kind of have a little bit of that comrade in arms sort of thing. Not as familiar with all the fine details, but yeah, that's something I have heard of, and I've actually known military officers of actually other militaries from other countries, like Chile, that actually trained the American soldiers that went over there at their schools. And a lot of training to pack, not as much riding, heck of a lot of packing.
Right.
And that is a whole art in itself in many ways. But in Chile, they still have a very, very active cavalry that they use a lot for kind of more internal issues, but because of the terrain, they need to have a cavalry for it. And they have a lot of mules that they use for packing up in the mountains because these are hills for them. Their mountains are steep and very much deserty, and so the mules handle it better, and if they do slip and fall, interestingly, they'll crumple their legs up and roll down the hill.